as are the chairman of the IATA Board of Governors, Willie Walsh, the Director General of IATA, and my name is Tony Consul. I'm the head of communications at IATA. I'll be moderating the discussion, both for those people here in the room, as well as those that we have joining us online. No need for more speeches, so we'll go directly to questions, and we'll do a version of in the room as well as online. So we'll start here in the room, and maybe in the front row, Danny.
Danny Lee, South China Morning Post from Hong Kong. Can Willie and Robin just explain how they feel about the split from China, how they disagree with the emissions target, the resolution as we saw that play out on stage, and how will you manage that externally, and how will you deal with it internally?
Well, I have to be honest, the Chinese carriers, in particular China Eastern, represented by Chairman Liu, who sits on the Board of Governors and also on what we call the Chair Committee, has been absolutely consistent and very helpful and very articulate in outlining the position of the Chinese carriers, with particular reference to the ambitions of the Chinese government. He has at all times stressed that they are committed to achieving net zero. The issue has always been the timeline, and we debated this at significant length. And there was, a good discussion within the Board of Governors as to whether we could facilitate the timeline proposed by the Chinese carriers of 2060. But the general view, particularly from those carriers in Europe, was that already we're seeing pressure to accelerate the achievement of net zero before 2050, and that moving it to 2060 would not be a position that they could accept. So, we're a democratic organization. It's always nice when everybody agrees, but we're very clear that the resolution has been passed by the majority of carriers represented by IATA, and that becomes the position of IATA. Each individual airline can set their own targets, and indeed many will. We have member airlines who are aiming to achieve net zero well before 2050. But I think the discussion reflects the challenge that this new ambition represents. As everybody in this room knows, decarbonizing the airline industry is a real challenge because we don't have a clear solution in the short term. Now, we do believe very strongly, and in fact our belief in this has increased in recent months. We do believe that there is a credible path to net zero by 2050, and indeed more and more a credible path to decarbonising the industry. So we move forward. We move forward as a democratic organisation where people have different views, and we respect those views, and we respect very strongly the commitment and the contribution that the carriers in China make to IATA. I've known Chairman Liu at China Eastern for many years. He's probably one of the most engaged members on the Board of Governors. He attends every meeting. He contributes and speaks at every meeting, and his contribution is, a very valuable contribution.
Can I just follow supplementary, because China Eastern will host the next AGM. Do you think that is a realistic timeline? Because it does seem like China will continue to keep quarantine measures in place. Are you banking on there being a delay to the AGM to October next year as well as a result?
No, our intention is very clear. We want to hold these events in person. We think it's very important. You heard what I said. We're delighted that we were able to get so many people to attend the event here in Boston. When we took the final decision about 2 months ago to go ahead with an in-person event in Boston, our view was simple. If 2 people turned up, we'd consider it a success. We weren't sure how many people would turn up, but we felt it was important for us to make the commitment and provide the opportunity for people to attend in person. And I don't know what the final figure was, but I think we had over 900 people registered for the event, and you can see yourself how many people have attended. So next year the intention is to hold it in person in Shanghai on the date 17th to the 19th of June. Chairman Liu has been clear with us in extending the invitation. He understands that it will be an in-person event. He can't give us a guarantee, but nobody can in the current environment. But our intention is that it will go ahead on the dates scheduled in person in Shanghai. So we're not looking to rearrange it to a later date. We want to get back to the normal routine of holding our AGMs in June.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another question in the room, and please, if you could identify your name and your publication, that would be great. Maybe Karen? There's a mic coming. Yeah.
Thank you. Karen Walker, Air Transport World. Willie, sorry to drag the point out a little bit about this, the 2050 agreement, but how does it actually work then? In that, because the Chinese airlines clearly had concern about the 2060 versus 2050. You say it's still up to the individual airlines, but I'm not quite clear. If it's an AGM resolution, doesn't that mean that all the IATA members are committed to that deadline?
The IATA policy on behalf of the industry is that we are now aiming to achieve net zero in 2050, and all of our activities, all of our engagement with bodies in relation to this will be on the basis that the industry is heading to net zero in 2050. When I say it's up to individual airlines, some airlines have the ambition of achieving it before 2050. So we're not asking them to slow down or to amend their ambition. How individual airlines achieve it will also be subject to their choices. We will identify a path for the industry. We've been very clear it is one scenario that can get us there, because I think what was important was not just that we were committing to net zero in 2050, but we could demonstrate a credible way to getting to net zero in 2050. But individual airlines will be free, obviously, to pursue their own methods. Already you've seen several airlines committing to carbon capture and sequestration, but not all airlines are doing that. So on our board, we have both United and FedEx who are investing heavily in carbon capture and sequestration. We have other airlines who are investing significantly in sustainable aviation fuels. So, as I said, all of our activities now will be to present the industry with options to get to net zero in 2050, and that is now the policy of IATA.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question just behind Karen.
Thank you. Julio Rivas, Agencia F. Going back to COVID-19, Mr. Walsh, you have objected the complexity of the government restrictions in international markets. But specifically, what limits does IATA want? Just an antigen test will be needed to fly, or just vaccination? Is there a clear answer of what limits do you support right now?
Yeah, let me comment, and then I know Robin will add his view on this. What we have said is that where people are fully vaccinated, they should be allowed to travel without restriction and without testing. So people who are fully vaccinated for international travel, we're not arguing that you need to be fully vaccinated for domestic travel, because as we've seen, domestic travel has continued right throughout this pandemic without any restrictions. So we're not suggesting that you introduce vaccination for domestic, but for international cross-border travel, that people who are fully vaccinated should be allowed to travel without restriction. Where people aren't fully vaccinated or can't be vaccinated, what we believe is that the knowledge of what we're dealing with now is so much better than when these restrictions were first introduced in January, February of 2020. The data is available. The quality of testing has significantly improved. And what we're saying is, if you approach this from a risk point of view, there are facts that we now know. The risk of you contracting coronavirus on board an aircraft are extremely low. And there's been quite a bit of research into that. We've also done quite a bit of research into what is the risk of somebody who has coronavirus and travels from one country to another, changing the dynamic of the coronavirus in that country. And again, we've done a lot of risk-based analysis. It clearly depends on the level of infection, the rate of vaccination, but feeding it all into the model, everything we have done shows that the risk is very, very small. And, I point to the UK because we've got a lot of data. 6.4 million PCR tests, 57,000 positive, a positivity rate of less than 1%, while at the same time in the general public, the positivity rate was 7%. So the risk is not that somebody traveling is going to change the dynamic of the coronavirus in the country that they're flying to. And therefore, if you look at the risk and assess the risk, there are measures that you can take to mitigate any risk that you feel exists. And what we believe is that antigen testing is a clear example of a good mitigant where rather than having to do a complex and expensive PCR, you can do an antigen test. And to support that, further, what we have is that of those 6.4 million PCR tests, because the UK government argued that PCRs were essential so that they could do sequencing, of the 6.4 million, 16,000 were sequenced. That's all. They sequenced 16,000 of the 6.4 million. So it's clear nonsense. The data is very strong and very clear that the industry is safe, and that you can put measures in place to provide adequate risk mitigation without imposing significant restriction on people or significant cost.
No, I mean, the only other thing I would add to that is the really encouraging governments to create a more harmonized and consistent approach to this. It is difficult for a lot of people who are looking to make trips. Sometimes people have not flown for a long time, and they're concerned because they're going to go to the airport. They know a number of things are required, and I think the harmonization of testing and vaccine requirements, etc., I think would be very helpful. And I also think this is where initiatives like the IATA's digital travel pass is extremely beneficial, because this will allow people to use it and upload all of their documents and really reduce that anxiety ahead of that travel and that journey.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin. In fact, we've got a question online which follows on from that. And the questioner asks, how important is it for governments to have a standardized set of certifications? And given that sort of situation that you've got many governments with different types of certifications, what is the impact on the IATA Travel Pass project?
Well, the impact on the IATA Travel Pass is insignificant in that it can adapt to any requirement. What's significant is the confusion it creates in consumers, as Robin has said. I'm sure all of you have experienced travel. I have. And, quite honestly, I've been confused at times as to what requirements I need to follow. What tests do I need to take? When do I need to take it? What forms do I need to fill in? The UK PLF, I know it sounds like I'm picking on the UK, but, UK PLF has 36 questions. I doubt anybody's looked at the answers to any of those questions. And yet, every time I've flown into the UK, I've had to fill in the form. And I'm filling in the same information 36 times on every visit. So it's we need a sensible approach here. And we're not saying that governments were wrong to introduce restrictions, because clearly in February of 2020, we were dealing with an unknown risk. But today we have tons of data available to us to assess the risk much better. And the idea that the measures that were put in place in February of 2020 are still relevant today is nonsense. Because the risk has changed. The level of vaccination has reduced the risk. The knowledge around treatment has reduced the risk. The concern that existed around health systems being overrun, that risk has reduced as well. So the risk has changed, and if the risk changed, the actions to respond to that risk should change. So it would be very helpful, as Robin said, if we could get towards a standard. We recognize that that's a challenge. But it clearly would be very helpful to avoid and remove the confusion that exists. But from an IATA travel pass, we can deal with any complexity. We just prefer not to have to deal with it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll go to Kathy. A mic is coming around in a second.
take this off a little bit. I'm sorry, I would like to come back to the question on the emissions target. So 2050, the Chinese carriers have been very open about it, that 2060 should be better. But I fail to see a little bit, if you can help me understand, that certain airlines in Africa, in certain part of Asia, that they say, okay, hydrogen is on my agenda, SAF is on my agenda, I have to get to zero emissions. To me, it looks like they're still struggling very much for their survival economically. So what was the feeling behind the scenes of your board and of your member airlines?
So what we did was we provided a pathway, I'll use that word, to demonstrate, and with 5-year intervals as to what we believed was necessary to achieve, targets, if you like. Now, we're very clear that this was one way of getting there. And we looked at what we know is available to us today and what we think will be available to us going forward. We didn't factor in complete unknowns. So, you know, we did factor in the potential for hydrogen-powered aircraft beyond 2035. We factored in sustainable aviation fuels, you know, effectively from today. So we see in the short term a significant ramp up in the use of sustainable aviation fuels. We see technology improving going forward. We see electric and hybrid electric being a factor, but not a significant factor, because I think the information we have today suggests that electric and hybrid electric will be good for short-haul, potentially small commuter-type aircraft. It's not going to be an effective issue for long-haul, wide-body aircraft. So different solutions for different types of aircraft, different stage lengths, but it demonstrated that, you know, there is a way for the industry to get to net zero in 2050. Now, without question, I assume 5 years from now we'll sit here and we'll have, you know, updated that significantly. I've listened very carefully to what Airbus has said about hydrogen. They seem ever more confident that they will have a hydrogen-powered aircraft in 2035. Boeing takes a different view. Boeing's view, having developed hydrogen-powered aircraft, you know, and looked at that technology, is that they see that as being more complex and more difficult. We're not going to argue with the manufacturers. What we are saying, though, is that what they're doing today isn't enough. You know, it's not good enough that we get incremental change in efficiency with the aircraft. To get to net zero, we're going to need a fundamental change. And that's why, you know, I think it's good that Airbus has committed to hydrogen, and we'll hold Airbus to that commitment, because clearly hydrogen, if it can be produced in a sustainable way, you know, so green hydrogen is the answer. Now, if you're using dirty energy to produce hydrogen, it's clearly not an effective way to decarbonize our industry. So there's a lot of complexity with this. But what we've said to our airlines is that, you know, between now and 2050, you know, we will set out various steps that can be taken, but that the immediate opportunity for the industry continues to rest with offsetting through CORSIA and the development of sustainable aviation fuels. But then there is also the significant contribution that could come from cleaning up air traffic control, which is still shockingly inefficient and structurally inefficient. So there's a lot that can be done.
Okay. Maybe if we can just try and limit to one question, because we've got limited time and I see lots of hands.
But my question was regional. Do you see Africa and Asia following this?
Yes. No, we've engaged with carriers in Africa and in Asia, and we've identified. But not every airline will follow the same path. As I said, some will see carbon capture and sequestration as an option. Others may see that that's too expensive or not available in their region. But, you know, elements of this will be adopted by all carriers.
Okay. And that leads to a question we've received online, which asks, are airlines also then free not to participate in the resolution if they're a member of IATA?
Well, no, in simple terms. And to be honest, I think consumers will answer that one much more loudly than IATA will, because what is clear is that, you know, we as an industry recognize that we need to do this, and that's internally when we debate this. But if you look at the consumer research that we do, What's positive is that they recognize actually our commitment. What's negative is that they don't understand necessarily how we're going to get there. But given the general consumer attitude towards the critical issue of climate change, airlines that don't engage to reduce their carbon footprint, I think will be measured by consumers. And, ultimately, we're all aiming to work together. I don't want to take away from what the Chinese carriers said, because they've been very, very strong in their commitment to achieving net zero. And I have no doubt that, the innovation that will become available will encourage them to accelerate their position. So I have no concerns about that.
Okay, thank you. And just as a reminder, we'll have lots of information, background information on the IATA website for those who want to dig deeper into some of the details of the commitment. We'll take a question at the back with Dina.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dina Kamel. I'm a reporter from the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi. Just to follow on some of my colleagues' questions about the resolution on climate change targets, can you give us some insight on potentially the cost that will be attached to proceeding with this target and how airlines that are already in a very economically fragile situation can deal with this added but necessary burden. And as a follow-up from that, we are seeing that oil prices are hitting nearly $80 per barrel. How far do you see that increase potentially impacting the slow and gradual recovery of airlines around the world?
Okay, in terms of costing, and we have costed a pathway. Again, I need to stress it's one approach to this, based on our assessment of what sustainable aviation fuels will cost and what carbon capture and sequestration technology will cost. The gross cost, and it is gross because it wouldn't be net, it's close to $2 trillion out to 2050. And some of that is the investment that would be required in new aircraft, but clearly new aircraft would be required anyway. So it is a gross cost. We haven't gone into a detailed assessment of what that would be net relative to what we would expect the industry to do. But it is a very significant financial investment. In relation to fuel, the forward curve on fuel is actually suggesting that oil prices will come down. Now, if you believe in forward curves, but we looked at the most recent September forward curve, which shows prices declining through 2022. So if you're a betting person, you'll say that it isn't going to happen, and if you're not a betting person, you'll say that it isn't going to happen. So, but your guess on fuel is as good as mine. I don't think it's going to impact. The issue with fuel is, and particularly in the current environment where very few airlines are hedged, the impact of any increase in the oil price affects everybody. It's not a competitive issue. So I don't see it having any impact on the forecasted growth that we're looking at from an IATA point of view.
The only thing I'd add, if I may, is I think the topic of the cost of this is important. I think the reason the industry has embraced this, though, is the cost of not doing this. Yeah. The cost of changing consumer trends over the next 20, 30 years, as Willie touched on. The approach that governments and other regulators will take for airlines who are sort of not embracing a lower carbon future. And I think it's extremely important that we remember that that's on the other side of the balance sheet of net zero carbon.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question there, and then Tim. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Heather Murphy from the New York Times. I have a question for Mr. Hayes. Just last week, Senator Feinstein in California urged the creation of a law that would require domestic airlines to require vaccination and testing for all passengers. In your position, both for JetBlue and IATA, what do you think of this? What is your response to that proposal?
So, overall, of course, we want as many people to get vaccinated as possible. You're increasingly seeing a number of employer mandates here in the US. I think the concern that we've expressed and others around the requirement for customers to be either vaccinated or tested is just the sort of operational complexity that goes with that. During early in the year, I think it was around 1.5 to 2 million tests were being done across the US per day. In the US, you could easily have over 2 up to 3 million passengers flying every day. And so, first of all, we're concerned if there's a testing requirement for people that don't get vaccinated, how much pressure that might put on the testing capability in the US. Secondly, there's the operational complexity. For example, if the TSA were to perform this function, do they have the regulatory approval and authority to do that? And so there's just a lot that has to be worked through, and then also managing the exemptions, so religious and medical exemptions, and how we would manage that. So I think that the complexities that come with that type of effort in terms of the domestic landscape make it extremely challenging, and it would mean people having to come to the airports earlier. It would mean longer lines. It would mean more people were required to perform these functions, and we're just not quite sure. We're not sure at the moment whether the system is ready for that.
Just about the complexity, for example, to come to this conference, we all did all of those things, and it didn't seem to create a huge obstacle for people.
Well, yes, but it's just the sheer numbers of people that are flying in the domestic market. I mean, you were up to nearly 3 million people a day flying in the summer, all arriving at airports across the country. Most people have learned to check in online. For domestic flights, they come to the airport very late, and they want to be facilitated through quickly. And so I think there's just a concern that I have as to whether the US system at the moment is able to perform that without a significant amount of disruption to people.
I think you've also got to ask the question, if you're mandating that for air travel, are you mandating it for other forms of transport as well? Because what is clear, as I said, is that the risk on board an aircraft is significantly less than the risk you would face on a train or on a bus or in a car. So what's special about air transport? Now, at IATA, we support vaccination. We believe the science. We've promoted it. But we have to acknowledge, as a global industry, vaccines aren't readily accessible to lots of people in the world. That is the reality. So the idea that you can only fly if you're vaccinated just can't operate on a global basis, because many people can't get access to a vaccine. So what we have said is we don't see any reason to mandate vaccination in domestic markets, because you're not introducing a risk at all. And for international markets, we would not support mandatory vaccination for passengers, because there are many parts of the world where that just isn't possible. And it would be grossly unfair if people who can't access a vaccine are prevented from flying. So that's why we say a sensible testing regime is as effective in terms of mitigating risk, and that's also why we're promoting the use of rapid antigen, which clearly has improved in terms of its reliability over recent months versus where it may have been in the initial stages of this.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
Thank you. Tim Heath from Reuters. So you're very coordinated today, but Willie said that the customer will decide. Robin, will airlines compete on the basis of who is the most green? Do you see that as a point of coordination, like in safety, where nobody competes on safety? Or will you, as an airline, be actively competing to see who will best execute the plan that we've heard today? And Willie, if I could ask you, the industry talks about taking new aircraft, but there are actually virtually no new aircraft in development. There are about 10,000 aircraft on the order books that were designed some time ago that will stay in service for 25 years beyond 2050. Doesn't that contradict your desire to accelerate your climate pledges? Thank you.
Go ahead, Brian.
Well, let me address the second question. No, I don't think it does, because as I said, we believe that sustainable aviation fuels is part of the answer. And the best performing sustainable aviation fuels can have a carbon footprint, life cycle carbon footprint of 80% less than kerosene. Now, it leaves a residual 20% that needs to be addressed. So it's not that we have to have hydrogen or we have to have completely new aircraft. What is important, though, is that the availability of sustainable aviation fuels, we believe, will significantly increase. But we can't depend on that forever. And that's why we're saying there needs to be new technology. It doesn't have to be available today, but if we don't push for that new technology today, well, then it's going to arrive too late. So, we acknowledge what Airbus has said, 2035 for hydrogen. I personally think that's very ambitious. But if they're saying 2035 for hydrogen, then that's fine. What it will mean, though, is when airlines are considering ordering aircraft, they will give very careful consideration to the aircraft that they're ordering if they can see that there's a new technology option becoming available. And that's no different to what has happened in the past. I can speak from personal experience. At British Airways, we didn't order the 777-300ER, fantastic airplane at the time. But we said, why should we order that when there's an even more efficient aircraft coming down the road behind it? Now, it was a mistake because the 787 and the A350s were delayed. But, you take those decisions today, it will be the very same in 10, 15, 20 years from now. People will look at what's available and look at what's coming down the stream. And you'll take decisions in relation to, what impact will this have on residual value of aircraft. So it is a very complex issue. And that's why it's important that we make the decision today that the industry is heading to net zero in 2050, because that gives people time to adapt and people time to think about what it is they're going to do. But I don't see that there's any conflict, as I said, because part of the solution will be sustainable fuels, part of the solution will be carbon capture, and there may well be other options that we haven't yet identified.
Yeah, and the first question, first of all, to see how the industry has come together on this resolution, I think is something, because we all see the importance of it. And so at that level, we all want the same thing. Are we going to compete to get there? Hell yes. This is a core part of our brand identity. Increasingly, airlines are going to want to be seen as being very mindful of their commitment to the environment. They're going to communicate that to their customers. But if that makes us better, and if that gets us to achieve this goal, and if that gets us to achieve this goal quicker, then I think that's a very good thing.
Okay, thank you. Take a question here.
Thank you, gentlemen. My name's Adam Crichton from The Australian. So my question is about masks, which is obviously the most visible COVID restriction that we have. Some commentators think that we'll still be wearing masks on flights within 12 months or maybe even in 2023. So my first question is, what is your best estimate of how much longer we'll be wearing masks on planes? And relatedly, what evidence have you seen that they significantly reduce the rate of transmission on flights?
So we did discuss this, and the view expressed by members of the Board of Governors at our meeting yesterday was that a mandate for masks should be removed as soon as it's scientifically demonstrated that it's not adding any value. So, the question is, you have people today who will argue that masks are ineffective. We're not saying that, it can be part of the solution, but at some point, the evidence will show it's no longer effective, as some governments have already done, where they've removed the requirement to wear masks. Others, like here in Boston, there is a mask mandate. So our view is, we don't have an issue with being required to wear masks on board an aircraft, but we think it would be wrong, because that decision was taken in 2020, that in 2030 we're still wearing masks simply because it was a 2020 decision. So when it's shown that the mask no longer adds any value to reducing the risk, that requirement should be removed. And that's what we said today. We shouldn't have measures in place for one day longer than they're required. And this is a problem that our industry has seen in the past. You know, security measures put in place, overtaken by technology, but you know, we still have the requirement to do it, even though the technology available to screen today is vastly superior to what was available when these measures were introduced.
I think the other point I'd add to that is, you know, as it's well publicized that airlines continue to have a number of challenges enforcing the mask mandates on board airplanes. All of the people that work in our industry do an incredible job trying to ensure customers wear those masks. You know, I think for the most part, most reasonable people will accept restrictions when they see the case for it. But in a world where case counts have come down, we've got even higher vaccination rates. As Willie said, the risks go down to such a level. If governments trying to enforce mandates after that point, I just think most people look at that and say, I really don't see any reason in that. We're not there yet. And masks were very important in the US earlier to get people flying again and give them confidence.
Okay, take a question in the front.
Thank you so much. I'm Yumiko Oshima from the Nikkei. My first question is for Mr. Hayes. How do you think international alliance means for your company to survive post-pandemic? And how do you see the recent DOJ action that sued your company and American Airlines to not to allow the recent partnership in East Coast? Yeah. And my second question is for Mr. Walsh. IATA just released the first outlook for 2022. So how do you see the recovery path, especially international and corporate demand?
So I'll take the first question. The question was about the Northeast Alliance with JetBlue, American Airlines, and the Department of Justice's decision to file suit to block it. Look, I mean, we believe very passionately that the NEA, that our partnership with American Airlines is good for competition. It has allowed JetBlue to grow in the Northeast at a faster rate than at any time in our history. The DOJ, in their own filing, recognized the JetBlue effect and the positive effect that JetBlue has on lowering fares when we start flying and competing with other airlines. It also allows JetBlue and American to partner, to work together to create a third, stronger competitor out of the New York airport. And so it's ironic that the Department of Justice, having presided over all this consolidation in the US, now seeks to block an agreement that is one of the best things that's ever happened for competition in the Northeast. So we will, we'll go to court and we'll make our case. And I would like to also just add by saying if the DOJ is successful and the suit is and the NEA is blocked, what that means is JetBlue loses all those flights, loses all those slots, and they go back to American. And I don't see how any of that is good for competition. If the Department of Justice is saying the JetBlue effect brings more low fares and more routes, why are they trying to seek to block a Northeast Alliance that does just that?
You convinced me, Robin. In relation to the recovery, 2022, we see domestic travel in effect being back to where it was. There are some domestic markets that have still been impacted, but we could say domestic is back to 2019 levels. But international travel will still be significantly down, and that remains the challenge. So the recovery will not be consistent across the world. We're forecasting losses in the industry, but that reflects a profitable North American industry. And pretty much loss-making outside of North America. There clearly will be individual airlines that will do better than that. But at the moment, the pace of recovery in international markets continues to be dictated by government restrictions, not by the virus. And I've been saying that for some time now. The crisis, the financial crisis in the industry in 2021 is not because of the coronavirus. It's because there are government restrictions stopping airlines from flying. And without question, if those restrictions are relaxed or removed, we know that the demand for flying will come back very quickly.
Okay, thanks. We'll take a question in the back.
Hello, this is Ashwini from India. I have two questions for both the gentlemen
Ashwini, if we could have one question, because we're running very short on time.
Okay. The Indian government is looking to review the air services bilateral that it has exchanged with various countries. Could we get the views of both the gentlemen on this move?
I think maybe we'll take that offline.
I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, the question was the Indian government is reviewing some bilateral
Oh, yeah.
agreements.
Yeah.
So perhaps, Ashwini, we can take that offline. We can have maybe one or two last questions. Seth?
Hi, Seth Miller.
Oh, he doesn't need a mic.
I guess if people are watching streaming, they can't hear me yell. Sorry. Seth Miller, PaxX.aero. Changing topics a little bit. Robin, you mentioned in your presentation from the board of directors about slots and slot waivers. And you know, the U.S. has made a change to how they're issuing slot waivers at JFK and LaGuardia, especially this year, related to international travel only. Do you still support those waivers, both as IATA and as JetBlue? And what is IATA's position on how much longer you expect slot waivers to be necessary?
Well, as you know, Seth, JetBlue had a slightly different position to this, to IATA, but that just talks to Willie's comment earlier that we're a sort of democratic organization. We're here in an IATA capacity, and so I'm going to defer to Willie to talk about that.
We have a simple view. I think it's wrong that airlines have slots put at risk when they're prevented from flying. I can understand people saying airlines should not have alleviation on slots when they don't want to fly. The situation we face today is that for many airlines, and it's principally those on international routes, they can't operate their aircraft because the borders are closed. And for them to have their slots put at risk because of that just does not make any sense. And there's limited options available to airlines to get around that. You know, if you look at an airline like, we say Finnair, who have a big market into China, the idea that Finnair can use their aircraft to start flying somewhere else just doesn't exist. The market is a Chinese market for them. So if they're prevented from flying into China, it would be wrong that their slots associated with those flights are put at risk. And that's our position. We appreciate the attitude that has been adopted up until this point. We think the alleviations that have been granted have made sense. We think that the EU has been overly conservative in terms of what the EU has done. We don't want a situation where airlines are forced to fly aircraft to maintain critical assets like slots, and therefore we think it's absolutely sensible and pragmatic for airlines to argue that if they're unable to fly, prevented from flying, that they should not have slots put at risk.
Okay, and we'll take one last question at the back of the room.
Good morning. My name is Sherman Briceby, South African Broadcasting. My question is for the Director General. You talked a lot about price gouging in the AGM. I wonder if you could reiterate those points. You talked about 90% increases at Heathrow, airports companies, South Africa, Schiphol in Amsterdam. Where should those shortfalls be made up, if not on the backs of consumers?
Well, it's a great question. So in the case of Schiphol, I think it's very simple. Schiphol is owned by the government. In the same way as airlines have had to go to their shareholders to raise additional equity or go to capital, the debt market to raise debt to improve their liquidity, airports should be required to do the same. You know, the idea that an airport can say, I lost, take for example, $1 billion in revenue last year because airlines didn't fly, so therefore I'm going to recover that $1 billion by charging the airlines that didn't fly an extra $1 billion this year when they are flying. It's just complete nonsense. Can you imagine if airlines tried to do that? You know, that we charge you because you didn't fly last year. You know, you'd laugh us out of court. But what we have here are suppliers who are in effect monopolies or quasi-monopolies who believe that, you know, they can pretty much do what they like. And we're not going to tolerate that. You know, we're going to fight back against this. You know, Heathrow raising prices by 90% when they're out there saying, you know, we listen to our airlines, you know, we appreciate their pain, but by the way, we're putting our charges up by 90%. You know, if you need evidence of gouging, all you have to do is look at the way these airports are operating. Airlines have been forced to take drastic action to survive through this crisis, improving their cost base, you know, going to shareholders, going to debt markets, begging for support to survive. The idea that, you know, you just sit there and wait for the recovery to start and then just lob all of the the money on the back of airlines is just unacceptable. So, we gave you some examples. They're not limited to those. There are others. But what we're seeing is increasing evidence that these monopoly suppliers believe it's okay for them to start trying to recover their lost revenues by increasing charges, which will only slow down the recovery. And therefore, we've got to call them out, and we will continue to call them out.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. The sessions are starting upstairs very shortly, so that will be the last question. There will be a concluding press conference tomorrow at the end of the World Air Transport Summit, so you're all invited back here if you have any extra questions. Otherwise, my team is available in the media center, and have a look at our website, IATA.org, in the press room for supplementary materials. Thank you all very much.